early today. Summer's winding down. The weather doesn't think so, but it is. We're going into the fall season. So that's kind of nice. It's always that changing of seasons that gets us to think, right? Just think about different things in our lives. And so I've got an opening question for you this morning. The opening question is, what are some daily habits or rhythms that you have in your life currently? Go ahead and shout it out. It doesn't have to be anything super spiritual. What are some daily what's that? Laundry. Waking up. Coffee. Yes. What's that? Journaling. Meditation. Eating. I want to put showering in there, although I don't quite get to it with a toddler. Yeah, right? Hit or miss on the showering part. What are some rhythms that you wish you had, but you're kind of fallen out of? What's that? Consistency. Phone calls. Exercise. That's mine. Contemplation, just pausing, right? Pausing to be still and take notice. Yeah, so we all have rhythms, whether good or bad. And like Charlotte, I really miss working out in the morning. So whenever Lee was younger, I got to get up, or I had the habit of getting up really early in the morning because Matt has to be at work by 5:30. So I was up early, found a gym that was 24/7. And now that she is toddler age, it is really hard to sneak out of a 1,200 square foot split level house without waking anybody up with squeaky floors. She's had the habit, actually, of trying to leave the house after I leave the house. And so I've gotten out of that rhythm, and I notice it, drastically noticed it change in my life. And so I had to kind of regroup a little bit. We're going through this season of the church. I think Sarah Beth mentioned it the other day that the church building currently is our gym. So we've been physically putting in some elbow grease and some work, and so trying to regather that rhythm and develop that daily rhythm in my life again with the changing of seasons is sometimes hard, right? Like people think, oh, I just need a good work-life balance. I just need to be what's balanced, right? And if we stay in balance, how long is it for? I mean, in reality. Right? And so I wanted to talk today about Sabbath and the Sabbath rest of God and living in those unforced rhythms of grace no matter what season you're in. So we're going to start in Genesis. The very first mention of Sabbath, we see that Sabbath is created and blessed. The first Sabbath was actually modeled by God himself. And this is important, right, to remember. In Genesis 2:1-2, it says, "Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all of their vast array. By the seventh day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the seventh day, he rested from all his work. Then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done." So we see that from the very beginning of time, God ordained Sabbath. He ordained a period of rest. So the Jewish people, they call it Shabbat, and they celebrate it once a week. And it's usually about 24 or 25 hours from sunset on a Friday evenings until sunset the next day on Saturdays. And it usually started with a meal or gathering together for worship. Sometimes they did something special like lighting a candle and saying certain prayers to really commemorate the weekly Shabbat. The next thing that we see is Sabbath is a command and a covenant. So with that weekly Shabbat time, this is taken from the 10 Commandments in Exodus 28, so 20 verse 8, and he's listing all the commandments. And the commandments before this was, don't have any other gods before me. Worship me and me alone. And on verse 8 it says, remember the Sabbath day, keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth. So he's bringing them back to Genesis, right, and reminding them of Genesis. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, but he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. So again we see that not only was it created and blessed, but it was actually a command that he gave to the Israelites early on. And to be honest, in the Western church we have lost some of this, right? We lost that commandment part of Sabbath. I think as the Western church, we tend to get busy with a lot of stuff, like a lot of commercialization, a lot of performance, a lot of things that we think are good, but maybe not necessarily God's best for his church. And he's establishing his best right here of living a life of Sabbath. Number 3, we see that Sabbath is communion and relationship. I love this passage and revisiting this passage. And it's one of my favorite verses. But I really had to look into the before and after chapters of this because it's super interesting. Because before this passage that we're going to read, Jesus gets really salty. Like, he's kind of out of sorts. He's been traveling from town to town, and several of these towns just didn't accept what he had to say. They were unrepentant. They didn't really grasp what he was saying. So you kind of see the human side of Jesus come out here. And before this, he's like, oh, woe to you guys who don't listen to me. Don't you get it? You're all going to hell. And it's just almost this rant, don't you see how jealous he is for you guys? Don't you see? And he goes on this rant of frustration, and he kind of goes on for a few verses in this. And then in the middle of this is where we're going to pick up on verse 20. And you could almost, when you read the text, you could almost just picture him just kind of ranting and then taking a breath. Father. Right? Have we all been in that place? We're just like, you're not getting it. Don't you realize how good he is? Don't you realize that he's the way, the truth, the life? And we get into these frustrating moments in our lives, and then, then we have a choice to make. Do we go on ranting? Do we go on in our frustration? Or do we turn our hearts and say, Father? And this is what Jesus does here. There's a couple of lines. He says in verse 25, at that time Jesus said, I praise you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, because you have hidden these things from the wise and learned and revealed them to little children. Yes, Father, for this is what you were pleased to do. And as Jesus does this, as he turns his heart to the Father and turns into communion with him, he kind of does this, he's being preached to by the Father, and he's preaching, right? And I had told somebody earlier this week, this sermon is actually preaching to myself as God is preaching to me as I preach to you. So it's one of those moments of like when you say something out loud. Have you done that with your kids before? When you say something out like, oh yeah, I got to realize that too. I got to realize I have to be patient. I got to realize I need to take it down a notch. Or I got to realize as soon as it comes out of his mouth, and then he says, all things have been committed to me by my Father. No one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, and those to whom the Son chooses to reveal to him. He's basically saying he's feeling that communion with the Lord of, oh, we know each other. So it's like as if the Father is saying, I know you. And Jesus is recognizing that back to him. I know him. We know each other. And whoever believes and whoever that is revealed to has the same. And then he says, and this is the one that you guys are probably most familiar with, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Again, I think the Father is also saying this to Jesus, right? Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. I really, really love the Message translation in this. It says, are you tired, worn out, burned out on religion? Come to me. Get away with me and you'll recover your life. I'll show you how to take a real rest. Walk with me and work with me. Watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. I won't lay anything heavy or ill-fitting on you. Keep company with me and you'll learn to live freely and lightly. What are some of the words that stick out there to you in that? Again, recognizing in the midst of sometimes our frustration, our overwhelmness, the relationship with the Father in the posture of Sabbath is communion and relationship. He goes on in Matthew 12, and we see Sabbath as complete through Christ. In 12:1 through 8, it says, at that time Jesus went through the grain fields, and this is after all of this had just happened, right? He went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry and began to pick some heads of grain and eat them. And when the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, look, your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath. And he answered, haven't you read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, and he and his companions ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for them to do, but only for the priests. And he's referring back to an older story in the Old Testament. Or haven't you read in the law that the priests on Sabbath duty in the temple desecrate the Sabbath, and yet you are innocent? I tell you that something greater than the temple is here. If you had not known what these words mean, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent. For the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. So we see in the beginning, God's resting place was all of creation, was the universe, was the garden. And then he moves into his resting places, the tabernacle and the temple. It was an actual place, right? And here, through Jesus, his life on earth, we are his third resting place. He is among us. He is Sabbath. It's an interesting thing to grasp, isn't it? Like, to imagine that the Lord of the universe, whose resting place was in the universe, has come to dwell with us, and us with him, abiding. And so to recap, Sabbath is created and blessed, It's a command and covenant. It's communion and relationship, and it's complete through Christ. So this is what he is trying to get the Pharisees to understand and grasp, that he is here. Something greater than the temple is here. To lay down their sacred cows, to acknowledge that he himself was in their midst. And when he refers back to the mercy verse, it was from Hosea 6:6, where it says, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, and acknowledgement of God rather than the burnt offerings. I really always found it really funny that the only way that the Pharisees would know about the disciples and them eating the grain from the fields is if they were following Jesus from town to town on the Sabbath, while they themselves were supposed to be in the synagogue. That sounds like a lot of work, right? How ironic. They were working really, really hard to disprove Jesus. The very point that they were trying to point out and judge Jesus on, they themselves were guilty of breaking. But that's an easy thing to do, isn't it? We do that all the time in our minds when God's calling us to Sabbath rest and to be at rest. It's hard to let go of those thoughts, of the judgment sometimes, of the religion, of the sacred cows, whatever they may be, whether it's work, whether it's screens, whether it's people, whether it's situations that are super intense that you just can't let go out of your mind enough to take a breath and rest in his Sabbath presence. It's all of these things that he's calling us to let go of, to enter into true rest. To take the posture of Sabbath is an act of celebration, worship, and remembrance. All things that we can't do if we're hanging on to something else. Sabbath is about putting God in his place as the king and throne of our lives and heart. As a king sitting on the throne of our lives and heart. How do we put God in his place? Sometimes it's a choice. Sometimes he makes the choice for you. Right? When you feel him beckoning and wooing us to take that posture, to take that breath and be like, oh, Father. It's an invitation. So what does that look like? To live in the unforced rhythms of his grace. So here's some tips for Sabbathing well on a practical point. It's worship and celebration. It's thankfulness. It's remembering who he is and his faithfulness. It's relationship over religion. You know, the Pharisees had to really keep up on their quest for righteousness, right? And we do that. We try to work like, oh, if I could just break this habit, or if I can do this or do that. And it's a lot of doing. They failed to see that they themselves were guilty of not keeping the Sabbath as God was calling them into being and not doing. And sometimes when we have rules for other people, when you catch yourself judging other people, it's because you yourself are frustrated that you break your own rules, right? What does it look like? It looks like taking care of our bodies and these temples right here. Exercising, eating right, like the practical things, sleep, getting into that circadian rhythm, how we're naturally created. Sometimes it takes preparing ahead of time. So getting the food prepared, having a relaxing atmosphere, making decisions ahead of time. I don't know about you guys, but how many of you, like after church, it takes 10 minutes to decide where to eat? Because I don't know, when are you hungry? I don't know, what are you hungry? So part of Sabbathing is preparing ahead of time and just getting the food ready ahead of time. It's just a simple thing. It means unplugging. So as we go into Sabbath next week, I highly, highly suggest that you take a break from screens. We're going to try to go 24 hours, so we'll see how that works. But the very minimum, I suggest 3 hours. Take 3 hours away from your screens to really hone in on the presence of the Lord. And it also means delighting and savoring the day together in relationship with Him, in relationship with others. Living a posture of Sabbath and developing this rhythm externally has a way of spurring on creativity as we live from an overabundance of resting in His love as a lifestyle. You know, Matt said earlier that Sabbath isn't the absence of doing, it's saying yes to the invitation to join God as His creation and creating with Him. He's constantly creating new things in your life. And it's an invitation to join Him in that. When He looked at creation, after He created, He looked upon it and said, "Oh, it is good. It is good." He looks upon each of us, His created beings, and say, "It is good. You are good." How long do we take to pause and to rest in that? Not only in His goodness, but in the fact that He thinks that we are good as well. I know I'm bumping up against some things like, there's an issue sometimes of unworthiness. I don't feel good enough. But He wants to tell you today, you are good. He's your creator. He's continuing to create. And Sabbath helps spur on thankfulness in our relationship with Him and each other. Dan, if you wanted to go ahead and come up. So as we take off this next week, these are things to remember, to take a break. And we were just praying, and it is always our prayer, like, Lord, in this house, don't let it be about the house, but let it be about the house, the temple of God. You guys are the temples of God. He's your resting place. He's your resting place. As we sang the song earlier, I love the Child of God song because it has some significance to us. When Everly was going, we were going through the adoption process with her at the very beginning. My sister had picked a previous family, and we were just praying, Lord, we don't want a piece of us moving across the country, right? And I had this dream, and I've shared it before, and it was this dream of just this vast ocean, and I have this little baby in my arms, and he splits the waters, and I walk to the very end, and I'm kind of even tripping and stumbling, and it's a long walk to the other side. And even in the dream, I'm thinking, oh, Lord, I'm going to hand her over to Jesus, and this is awesome, right? Or I'm going to hand her over. And it wasn't. I was handing her over to these parents that my sister had picked. And Jesus was standing behind them. And I woke up from that dream, and I'm like, Lord, I can't surrender like that. Because I knew I was her mama. You're asking me to surrender like that. And he brought me to this place of, are you willing to surrender even if you don't know the outcome? Are you willing to trust me? And as I worked through that, and I just pictured myself handing her over to these other parents, I just felt the peace of God in the midst of a very, very intense situation. And I was at rest. I was at rest. And we know, obviously, that things turned around. He was the God who knew He had placed that in our hearts. And the only way I could describe it is a miracle that she's with us today. But here's the thing. We get overwhelmed by the walls of water, the enemy behind us, there's the emotions and the intensity of certain situations. And it seems like a long, long trek. But surrender. Surrender to the God of the Sabbath, the only one who could bring that rest. Go ahead and stand. I'm going to close. I want you to go ahead and, if you feel comfortable, close your eyes and hold out your hands. I'm just going to pray Sabbath rest on us. Lord, we thank you that you are the God of the Sabbath. We thank you that you long to dwell with us. It says in your word, you are jealous for us. You are jealous for us. So we lay down the things keeping us from resting completely 100% in you. We say yes to your invitation for communion. We say yes to your invitation of loving us. Come, Lord. Come, Holy Spirit. Things that I talked about, first and foremost, if you want to know what it's like to have that relationship with God and you sense Him drawing you closer, I want to pray with you today. Because He desires you. And the second thing is breaking off those religious tendencies. I know it because I used to be it. The Lord wants to free us from the idea that the church building is the only place where we can meet Him, that the laws are the only thing worthy. He wants to say, you're worthy, and I'm worthy of communion with each other, abiding with each other. And so if that's you, we would love to pray with you. And then the third thing is that if you had any physical things going on, we'd also love to pray for healing. We're a church that believes in healing. So we would love to pray for you regarding that. So we're going to worship for a little bit, and then we'll close.